Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys a very brief introduction to texture painting inside of Blender. So to access texture painting, we would go to the bottom left hand side of the 3D viewport and change it to texture paint mode. And what we do here is that on our 3D object, we would first want to UV unwrap it, which is where we take the 3D shapes, flatten them out, make them 2D, and basically position all the sides on a single image. And normally we could take that UV unwrapped image into a program like Photoshop and use brushes on it there, but instead we actually have the ability to do it straight within Blender should we choose as well. So as long as we're in texture paint mode, for an object that hasn't been UV unwrapped, it's going to mention missing UVs in the top left hand corner. Now you can hit the add simple UVs button, which would work just fine for a basically a starting cube like this. The other way to do it, and because you have a real model, you're probably going to need to work on it and make it so that, well, here, let me do UV unwrap. But when you have a more complicated shape, and this is the UV image viewer, but when you have a more complicated shape, the UV unwrap is going to look a lot different, and I don't really want to get into that too much in this video because that's a much bigger topic. But you do have to actually take the UV unwrapped shapes, position them on a single image in a way that actually makes sense to you, that you can paint on, and then when those paints show up on the actual model, they look good. For a cube, because all of these different faces are just layered on top of each other, we can paint all sides of the cube in a very simple manner. It's a flat object without really needing to go any further than that. But yeah, I would suggest checking out some other UV unwrapping tutorials if you haven't done that already. In any case, back to texture paint mode. Since we have the basic UV unwrap added to this cube here, the only thing we need to do is to add a texture slot. So these textures, that's what you're actually putting on the UV shapes. Those also show up here in the texture area for the object, but we want to add a paint slot. So I'm just going to use the defaults here, and you see that this diffuse color texture paint slot gets put over here. This is actually an image, and we're basically drawing straight onto the image. Hopefully that sounds a bit like any paint program that you've ever used, because basically UV texturing is just taking a 2D image and putting it on a 3D object. So now that we have the texture space, the image for the texture, and we have the UV unwrap so it knows where to put all of the information, we kind of just need to draw on it. So the default tool in texture paint mode is just a simple brush. You can use a drawing tablet for this, and if you're serious about it, it's probably a good idea. Radius if you want to control the size of your brush, and we can just draw straight onto it. You see that it's kind of a repeating pattern, but also because all of our faces are layered on top of each other, the same thing gets drawn on every single face. Of course, you could take these different faces and position them in their own spot in the image if you want to draw on each one individually and you don't want them to overlap and show the same thing. So in addition to the default draw brush, you can also change the blend mode, subtract if you want to just remove stuff, add if you want to add it, and then mix is probably what you're going to be using most of the time. You also have a bunch of other ones here that I haven't really played around with that much, but may look familiar to some of you guys. And then if you want to do things like basically blur the edges of whatever you're drawing, smear them, you can come up here for the tools, or then if you want to create a mask, you can also do that. So layer masking, pretty popular to do that in Photoshop as well. So then if you come down here to stroke, there's a few useful settings here. One of which being smooth stroke. So the idea here is that as you try to stroke your brush, and you don't have a very steady hand, or you're trying to do it with a mouse, that whatever brushstroke you try to do is going to be smoothed out a bit. And it does that by basically having a trailing weight behind it. So you can kind of see here, it's controlling my brush a little bit and making it easier to get a smoother result rather than having that turned off and getting a result something like that. In addition, stroke method is probably going to be decently important. In most cases, space is going to be the option you want for just general brush strokes. But if you're trying to get a different kind of result, you might try something like stroke method line, which allows you to actually left click and drag to put a very straight line on your model. And drag dot allows you to create a pressure sensitive, well, dot on your screen. And the thing that's nice about this is as long as you're still pressing down, it can be positioned wherever you want it. And of course, if you have a brush and a drawing tablet, it's going to be compatible with your brush dynamics. So you can have it set up so that the harder you press, the thicker the dot is going to be. So a couple more quick things real quick. There are curves inside of Blender, and I don't fully understand exactly what they do. I think it has to do with when you start drawing, like how quickly whatever lines you create are supposed to come out, and that's depending on starting positions and ending positions of your vertices here in the curve, and you can move them around, of course. But more importantly than that, symmetry. So if you want to draw with symmetry, which may be a very good idea if you have a mirrored model. So that's, imagine a human and you have both sides looking the exact same. You can actually texture paint with symmetry here too. And this will be useful, especially if you don't have basically all of the similar components perfectly lined up with each other in your UV texture. That's over here. So like if you don't put the hand on top of the hand, you can still have both hands get drawn in the same way. So if we enable symmetry, I can start drawing a bit on, let's change that stroke from anchored back to space. But we start drawing and it's mirrored across the y-axis, or whichever axis we want to choose. So X symmetry. And let's try doing a bit of that. And yeah, hopefully you can see that happening. And that'll be really useful because whenever you can cut your work in half, basically with like mirror modifiers or the equivalent, that's going to be really handy. So I hope that's going to be enough to get you guys started in at least understanding the basics of texture painting inside of Blender. It's pretty cool that you don't necessarily have to pull the UV texture image out to a third-party program to work on it. You still might want to do that because, of course, tools that are completely dedicated to texture painting are going to have more features available. But for some basic stuff, you can do that straight within Blender. So I've been Chris. I hope this video has helped you guys out, and I will see you guys in my future video content.